It is my pleasure to announce the speaker for today's meeting, Mr. Rick Gregory. If I could give him a hand and he might come on up here and let me do Before I start talking to you about what I've been asked to talk to you about, you talk about we need to know our history. And we need to teach young people our history. As somebody who has made his living for the last 35 years telling stories, don't talk to folks out there about history, or they think it's history. Tell them stories from history. That'll get their attention much more than if we just say 1892 so and so happened. Tell them stories. That was the truth. Now, probably we need to say a word to you about how I got here with you. Well, as luck would have it, and I do believe, where are you at? Sorry, Miss Linda. She says it's a God thing. So, in January, my wife and I always used to spend a month at the ocean, and then my wife could be at the ocean, and I'd fly in and out of Panama City to go to work. You see who the boss is in my family. And so now we do it 2 weeks, and we were pulling in to where we were going to stay. I'm unloading the car. This truck pulls up next to me, and it had a plate on the back of it that says Kentucky, Caldwell County. And Miss Linda got out, and I said, I bet y'all know where Princeton is. She said, how do you know? And I said, I got a cousin who works in Princeton, and the thing's right there, and I know him. And she said, well, what's his name? And I said, Jason Redfern. She said, you know Jason? I said, yes, ma'am. And so that started a conversation, and she said, are you a talker? And I said, yes, ma'am. I make my living speaking. Now, this is true. She didn't ask. She said, you're going to come to Princeton and talk. Does that sound like the person that you know? You're going to come to Princeton and talk. You know what I said? Yes, ma'am. I didn't get to be 72 years old telling a woman no when she told me to do something. And I got a wife for 40 years, and she tells me what to do. Now I've got another woman telling me what to do. And she says, you're going to come to Princeton. And so I said, yes, ma'am, I will. And she says, another true story, she says, now we're going to pay you to come. And I said, no, ma'am, you're not. She says, yes, we are. And I said, no, ma'am, you're not. And she said, well, at least let us buy your gas. And I said, no, ma'am, you're not going to buy the gas. And she said, yes, we are. And I said, ma'am, you are not big enough to whoop me and make me take your money. And so finally, I won one. So it got some of you probably going, I actually won one talking to Linda Higgins. But I did. And so some telephone calls back and forth, and we had a good meal together. And your husband and my wife, and in the conversation, she said, well, what kind of things would you speak about that might be something folks in Princeton would know about and where you come from as well? And I said, well, we share the Black Patch War. We share the Bell Witch. And a whole lot of other things. And she said, talk about them all. And so I said, yes, ma'am. So today, I'm going to talk to you about Trail of Tears. And I'm going to talk to you about those three things. First of all, Trail of Tears. Secondly, the Black Patch War. Thirdly, the Bell Witch. Now, the first one is hard. As we'd say at home, and I expect some of y'all have heard this phrase, how do you put lipstick on that pig? This is a hard story. And so how do you take that story and make it something that people can listen to and find something positive coming out of it? So I'm going to ask y'all, as I talk to you about the Trail of Tears, I'm going to ask you to remember 3 words. First word is wickedness. Second word is perseverance. The third word is remembrance. I'm going to ask you what the next word is. The first word is wickedness. This is, again, a horrible story. And one way to look at it is through Davy Crockett's eyes. Davy Crockett, I'm going to give you a couple quotes from Davy Crockett. He was the right-hand man of Andy Jackson, both from Tennessee. Jackson gets to be president, and Davy Crockett is in line to be a president of the United States because he's Andy Jackson's man. But then the Jackson administration passed the Indian Removal Act, 1830s, and Davy Crockett said, no, this is wrong. He had been at war with the Creeks with Jackson and saw what American troops did to the Native Americans. And he said, no, that's wrong. And then when the Indian Removal Act came, he said, that's wrong as well. So he put himself up against, this is a guy who's a member of the House of Representatives, and he is opposing the president and the president of the United States that could make him a president in the future. But he said, I've got to put my conscience over my political career. And he did. He said that the Indian Removal Act was oppression with vengeance and a wicked, unjust bill. Of course, the bill's backed by the President of the United States. He says, several of my colleagues got around me and told me how they loved me and how they wanted me not to ruin myself. You cannot face Jackson and win. You're ruining your career. And he said, I've got to put my conscience over my career. He did. And, of course, the whole party turned against him. And he goes to Texas to try to rebuild his reputation in Texas and come back as a political person from Texas, and of course dies at the Alamo. But he saw personally that this was wrong, and I cannot be a part of this. Now, when I say this is wrong, what was the second word I gave you? Perseverance. Perseverance. And so what did these people have to persevere through? And then I'm going to turn to more positive ideas about the Trail of Tears. I'm from Robertson County, and I know that the Trail of Tears folks came through here. They also came through Hopkinsville before they got here, but before Hopkinsville, they came through Robertson County, Tennessee. And they crossed over the Red River, where Sulphur Fork hits the Red River, at my grandfather, what later was my grandfather's house, your great-grandfather's house. Now, those who had money amongst the Native Americans, they got to take a ferry across. That ferry ran out of the building that later became my grandfather's house and your great-grandfather's house. The others had to walk across. And by the way, a lot of these better off Native Americans brought slaves with us. And so slaves had the same kind of things to deal with as did the Native Americans. And I'm going to read to you a couple of things that came from a letter from Fort Wayne, Tennessee. And by the way, I live about a mile from where the Native Americans crossed over the river into what eventually would be very quickly Kentucky out there. This is a letter of somebody. He wrote this letter in where I'm from, but he wasn't from there. But this is where the letter was, and it's in the archives in Robertson County. The people, he's talking about his people, the Native Americans, the people are very loath to go on and unusually slow preparing to start in the morning because they are moving not from choice but to an unknown region that they did not cite. And this is where wickedness came from. And he said, tell our friends that we're on the journey west, arising from the acts of wicked men and from our unfortunate fate. I'm going to read one more thing to you here. 1996, Tennessee became a state. I think Kentucky was 1892, if I remember correctly. Is that right? 1892. Tennessee was 1896. And Robertson County became Robertson County at the same time Tennessee became a state. So the bicentennial of my home county was 1996. I wrote the county history. And I'm going to quote a piece from somebody in Robertson County. We met several detachments just this side of Kentucky in December 1898. The last detachment passed us had roughly 2,000 Indians. We found the road literally filled with possessions from about 3 miles in length. In other words, folks got tired of carrying things, and they just dropped it off by the side of the road. And I'm sure that happened at Princeton as well. We learned from the inhabitants on the roads where the Indians were passing that people just died. On an average day, we buried 14 to 15 people at a stopping place. That's where they would stop and rest, and some of us would not get back up. And we buried all that we could. Now, how do you take that story and find something positive out of it? And the very fact that you are all here is an example of how we can take that story and find something positive. Now, perseverance. Perseverance. Thousands of people died. And this was the one that came through where I'm from and where you're from. It's just one of several different times that Native Americans passed through going to Oklahoma. And so some died. And some just sat down and didn't die of tuberculosis or other things that got pneumonia that got them on the trail, but just tired and just quit wanting to live. But the vast majority did. The vast majority made it to Oklahoma. They persevered. And that story of perseverance, I think, is one of the things that y'all celebrate. The fact, not that all the ones that died, but the ones that lived. Yes, this was wrong. It should not have happened, but it did. But hopefully we being here are recognizing the fact that they lived, they had children, and they have people living now in places because they persevered when they were in Princeton. They persevered when they were other places all along the route. Roughly 800-900 miles. Now imagine walking 800 or 900 miles. But they did. So perseverance is important to us. And one other thing I'd like to put in front of you, and that is a lot of people along the way, a lot of white people along the way helped them. They fed them, and they provided them with fresh water. They provided them with medical help in places in Robertson County, Caldwell County, and other places. I'm not saying everybody, but enough so that it helped some of those people get to Oklahoma that never would have gotten to Oklahoma without people like us and our part of the world stepping forward to help them. So that's a very brief concept about what happened with the Trail of Tears and how we can take that story and find positive things out of it. Now we'll stop for a moment. You're all here, and this organization is, if I understand correctly, is built around the concept of the Trail of Tears. Somebody, why did you decide this is what you wanted to be part of? Am I on track in what I said about we want to celebrate the fact that some people, most of them, persevered and went on with their lives? Why did some of you decide this is a group you want to be part of?
Well, I know story passed down is that I had a relative that left the Trail of Tears up in Dixon Springs, and there was a farmer that helped him. And he ended up taking on the farmer's name, so we never knew what our Cherokee name would have been, but he had made it up to Dixon Springs.
For the example that some people helped, this guy got away,
Yep.
but somebody local helped him, and without that help, he'd have been found
Right.
and gone. Thank you. Anybody else? What made you decide, I want to be part of this? Ma'am?
My niece has researched our family back, and we had a Cherokee princess that was married about 4 generations.
So somebody in your background. Thank you. Anybody else? Why are you here? Anybody? I've had 2 women. Hey, man, are you here just because the women told you to come? Why are you here? Somebody get those. Sir?
Well, for years I ran into the public of the Trail of Tears in that house, and I became interested in the Trail of Tears and people that worked with it. Decided to go into it deeper and find the actual path that they took, and that's what I've done for all the years.
You wanted to find the exact path? Yes. And I'm assuming, but I don't know, are there any areas here around Princeton that you know exactly where the path was? Okay, I see several people shaking their heads, yes. Same thing is true where they crossed over the river. We have preserved part of the path there at Fort Worth as well. Anybody else? Now
I'm here to honor my grandmother.
Pardon?
I'm here to honor my grandmother.
Okay, and what's the honor?
That she told me the story of our heritage when I was a child, who we ever met. And at that time, my father would tell her, quit telling me all these stories, because at that time it wasn't popular to talk about this. So then she would hush for a few days, and then I'd sit down by her again, and then we would start telling me again about my heritage. So I'm here to honor her.
The
And
honor.
I was such an honor and privilege. I had ridden the Trail of Tears away from Guthrie, around Guthrie to Caldwell. What an honor and privilege that was for me to do that.
Thank you. And just one final idea about what happened with the Trail of Tears. We humans are capable of doing really bad things. And my people have been in Robertson County, your people have been in Robertson County over 200 years. And I expect some of your folks have been here that long. People are capable of doing bad things, but we're also capable of doing good things. And I think we can find a lot of things about the Trail of Tears to say, yes, this was wrong, but there were people who did the right things. Thank you. Now, the second thing I've been asked to talk to you about is the Black Patch War. Coming from Robertson County, that's where it started. That's where it started. So I know about the raid in Princeton. I expect most of you know, so I'm not going to go into great detail about the raid in Princeton. That would be December 1906. And of course, then it's going to be followed by the major raid on Hopkinsville. And there's going to be a raid on Russellville, the 3 biggest areas that were raided. And if I remember correctly, in Princeton, the Nightriders burned the Orr warehouse and the Steger. And Steger and what? The second warehouse had 2 names, Steger and who? Steger and Dollar. Thank you. And so those kind of things that happen here happen quite often all over the Black Patch. And Dr. Amos, how close are we to where Dr. Amos was from?
10 miles.
10 miles. So where Dr. Amos was from is 10 miles. And by the way, he denied that he had a trial and and one crowd. Everybody knew who the head of the Nightriders were. Got graves, and 10 miles from here, out there. Now, so instead of talk about specific what happened in Hopkinsville, what happened here, I'm going to talk in general. How did this happen in the first place? How did it come out that people in our area, in the Black Patch, which we're close to the northern part of the Black Patch. I live in Robertson County, which is the southern part of the Black Patch, and we'll go out a few counties in Kentucky and Tennessee. It's just a handful of counties in the United States that this happened in. So how did it happen that people turned to massive violence where I'm from, where you're from? I would expect some of you know stories about your relatives that were on one side or the other in the Black Patch War. I know my stories. I see you shaking your head back here, sir. And so some of us probably have heard stories, and we're probably told not to tell those stories out there. I can tell by the smiles. The answer to that is, yeah, that's true. Now, we'll get back to stories in a moment. But how did it happen? How did it happen that this group of people in the Black Patch, my people, your people, turned to massive violence when they did in other areas? Here, not there. How? Well, first of all, I think we've got to understand what happened in tobacco, not tobacco culture, but in tobacco economics. Go back to the late 1890s or so, and an average farmer's going to make somewhere in the neighborhood 4, 6, 8 cents a pound. 8 cents a pound, you can feed your family. You can send your kids to school. By the way, at a time when there weren't public schools, you had to pay for your kids to go to school. You could do those kind of things, especially if you got up to 6, 8 cents a pound out there. So, you're making money in a Black Patch. You're feeding your families. You're sending your kids to school. You can put clothes and shoes on them. And then in 1890, a fellow named James B. Duke, is that name familiar to most folks? James B. Duke, what was the name of the company he put together? We end up calling it the Duke Trust. It was the American Tobacco Company. And so it became known as the Duke Trust. But what he had in mind at the very beginning was he didn't care about us. He didn't care about if we could feed our families. He wanted to make as much money for, who would you guess? James B. Duke, as possible. And so his idea was, I need to put together a monopoly of people raising tobacco or selling tobacco where they have to sell to me. There's a lot of different companies before 1890, but by 1900, Duke had put together what became known as the Duke Trust. And by about 1900, 1903, 1904, if you were going to sell tobacco in Princeton, you were going to sell tobacco in Springfield, Tennessee, where I'm from, you had to sell to Duke. And instead of 6, 7, 8 cents a pound, tobacco by 1904 in this area was selling for 3, 2, 1. 3 cents a pound for the best, then the middlings, and then the worst league. 3 cents, 2 cents, 1 cent. Farmers in the Black Patch called that 3, 2, 1 and a cussing. And by the way, I come from people, most of you come from people that ain't going to take the cussing. Is that a fair statement? Nobody's going to cuss you and get by with it. We call it 3, 2, 1 and a cussing. So, some farmers starting in Robertson County, Tennessee, got together, and they said, what we have to do is if Duke has a monopoly of buyers, let's put together a monopoly of producers. Let's put together a union of tobacco farmers, and we're going to hold our crops off the market until we force Duke to raise prices. That was a very simple idea. They put together what became known as the Dark Fired Planters Protective Association, and it started originally about 1904. A fellow named Felix Ewing in Robertson County was the head of it. And by the way, Ewing was brilliant. He was brilliant. You know why I think that? He married the richest woman in Robertson County. He just did. He married the richest woman in Robertson County, and by the way, over the next 20, 30 years, spent all the money and got bankrupt in a rented apartment in Nashville. But at the time he started the Tobacco Association, he's living in Glen Raven. This is one place to visit one of these days. Glen Raven, one of those beautiful places in the county, thousands of acres. And so he starts the Planters Protected Association. The other two big people at the beginning are brothers that live on the other side of Adams, and it's Joel and Charles Ford. They were one of the founding families in Robertson County. They got together, put together an association. We're going to hold our crops off the market, and we're going to force Duke to raise prices. Now, think about it for a moment. If Duke has a monopoly and the association wants to put together a monopoly of buyers, what's the problem? Other than the fact Duke isn't going to be happy. What's the problem? A monopoly means everybody has to belong. So what's the problem? Not everybody wants to join. And those people that don't want to join, Duke and his people turned their attention to them, and it went something like this. Oh, we know we weren't paying you enough money in the past, but we're sorry, and we're going to start paying you more money. And hopefully being able to lure more people away from the Tobacco Association in the process. Now, I want to be very careful here. Be very careful. On one side is going to become the Nightriders. The other side is going to become what was called, in my part of the world, and I would guess up here as well, what was called hillbillies or independents. Y'all heard that term before? I see that smile back there. And by the way, I understand both sides. As a historian, I can understand I'm not going to let my children starve. And I know what the problem is, and if I got to turn to violence, I'm going to turn to violence. I can understand that. On the other side, I can understand this is my farm. This is my crop. I'm breaking my back growing this tobacco. Nobody's going to tell me what to do with my tobacco. And plus, I've got to worry about my family. That's number one. And so why hold my crop off if I can make 6, 7, 8, 9 cents a pound and feed my family? So I can understand how somebody could do this and somebody could do this. As a historian, you've got to be able to see both sides of something, not just one side. So, when some people did not want to join, those that were members of the association started visiting, talking. You know, could you understand why we need to do this? And I know it's hard, but I'm holding mine off, you hold yours off. And some came over to the association, but many did not. So, Steinbach Schoolhouse. Anybody been to Adams? Adams. Come see us sometime in Adams, out there. And about 3 miles out of what's downtown Adams. Downtown Adams is a big place. We got a grocery store, and wait a minute, we got a dollar store now. Oh, we have gotten big time in Adams. We got a dollar store. And you actually buy gas in Adams. That's about it. That's all it is. At that time, it was bigger. So a group of farmers got together at the Steinbach Schoolhouse, and they put together what they called a series of resolutions. And the number one resolution was this, that we're going to visit everybody out there that doesn't join the association and sells their tobacco to the American Tobacco Company. We're going to visit them in groups of no smaller than 5 and no larger than 2,000. And convince them to join the association. What does that mean? 5,000 to 2,000, what does that actually mean? Pardon? I'm going to intimidate you.
Mob rule.
Pardon?
Mob rule.
And it could easily turn into mob rule. It's going to be intimidation. If you don't join, bottom line, we'll hurt you. And they did. It started in Robertson County, but then very quickly it spread to counties through Tennessee and through Kentucky. It spread to Caldwell County out there. So you've got this division of people, for those who join, those who don't. And by the way, it didn't just affect what am I going to do with my tobacco. It affected who am I going to go to church with. There were churches that were nobody but those that joined the association or the church. There's another church where people who are not in the association are independents. So churches split out there as well. Families split. Some people joined and some people in the family did not join out there. So in the beginning, and by the way, I know all of this because I wrote my doctoral dissertation at Vanderbilt about the Tobacco Wars and the association that they came out of. And a whole lot of people told me a whole lot of stories. They said, you can't tell people I told you this story. Because even today, there are people who do not want to talk about openly what happened in the first decade, going into the second decade of the 1900s. But they told me stories, and I used some of those stories. That's where I gathered a lot of this information. So, you've got those that join, those that don't, and those that don't join, they begin just by doing something simple. Threatening people with a gun in your hand. Not hurting anybody, just having a gun in your hand can be a threat. You better join the association. I pointed at a woman, I'm sorry. My wife was video, you know it. You better join the association. And if you don't, I'm coming back. That kind of, no purpose, nothing yet, but you've been warned. You have a gun in that pocket, will you? Okay, I'm just role-playing here. Just role-playing. That's how it started. But then it went from that to come to your crop and take a tobacco stick and knock the leaves off in the middle of the night. I'm going to set your barn on fire after you get the crop in the barn. Those kind of things. And when those kind of things did not work enough, then that's where the raids started. That's where we've got to do something bigger than go out to somebody's farm or try to intimidate people individually. We've got to do something that directly intimidates buyers. They didn't come to Princeton to burn your people's houses. They came to Princeton to burn oil, to burn Speeder and Dow. And they did. They came to Hopkinsville to burn warehouses. They came to Russellville and burned warehouses, and a whole lot of other smaller places as well. Burn those warehouses and whip who we need to whip out there. Probably the one that is best known is the one in Hopkinsville. And they came in, I think y'all were December 1906. Hopkinsville was in December 1907. They came in, whipped who they wanted to whip, hurt who they wanted to hurt, burned what they wanted to burn, and left. And women in the room, those that don't join are trying to figure out how do we deal with this? How do we deal with it? Because in Caldwell County, in civil court, you're not going to win a case in Caldwell County against nightriders. In Robertson County, you're not going to win a case against nightriders in Robertson County. First of all, you ain't going to find a jury with 12 people that some of them wouldn't be nightriders. So the court system isn't going to help you out there. So what do? Women in the room, not men, a woman figured out what to do. Mary Lou Holloway. Anybody heard of Mary Lou Holloway? Where's she from? Right here. Well, I'm interested. The women I don't know. The men are going, I don't know. Mary Lou Holloway, right here. So, Mary Lou ran, I guess here in Princeton, wasn't she? Yes. Excuse me. She ran a little boarding house restaurant, and she badmouthed the nightriders. Well, she is told, warned several times, you better stop. If you don't stop, we will come first. And they gave her several warnings, and she said, I'm not afraid of the nightriders. I'm going to speak the truth out there. Men might not be willing to speak the truth, but Price. Price. I knew it wasn't a normal first name. Price. Thank you. And he watched it. He had to see that happen. And I have been and read the federal court case that happened here. And so they said, we're not going to kill you. They beat him and said, you've got till tomorrow. No more than the day after tomorrow, be out of Caldwell County. And they were. She figured out we will never win a case in court, county court, in any county in the Black Patch, but maybe we could win a civil suit in federal court. And she went to a lawyer in Bowling Green, and he told her how to go about doing it. And so they left. I forget where they went now. Maybe somebody knows. Where? Southern Illinois. Yes, Southern Illinois. And established residency, and then sue. And then when you sue, you're suing as a citizen of one state against a citizen of another state, which puts the case in federal court in Louisville. And she wins. She wins the case. And she's not after, remember I said civil, she's not after people going to jail. What is she after? Money. And where you really want to hurt them, go after the money. And she does, and she wins. And a statement that became quite common in Caldwell County was, how you doing out there in the tobacco patch? I'm holding tobacco for Mary Lou. Because the money went to her. And that pattern became quite prevalent all over the Black Patch. How to find a court case that you can take to federal court. One happened, Jason, in our county, Denise Drescher, and by the way, I've noticed coming up here that y'all growing a whole bunch of corn up here, but I saw very little wheat. Very little wheat. But at the time of the Black Patch War, wheat and tobacco were like this. The growing rhythms of wheat and tobacco are very different, so that when you have to have a whole lot of time in producing wheat, it's not when you need to be in tobacco patch, and vice versa. So a lot of folks who grew tobacco also grew wheat. And an idea in the Black Patch went something like this. Wheat might be king and queen, corn might be queen, but tobacco pays the bills. So tobacco's still number one. But wheat's important. And so most people couldn't afford a wheat thresher. But what somebody would buy a thresher, and somebody in this community would, somebody in this community, and that one man or a family would thresh for a whole lot of people. As you might guess, this he threshes only wheat from people who belong to the association. This guy over here, he threshes wheat for people who are independents. And in our home county, there was a fellow that had been sheriff of Robertson County, later went to Clarksville, and became sheriff in Clarksville. And he worked with a family called the Beneses and bought this thresher, and they're threshing wheat for independents, Nightriders, and yes, I know who those Nightriders are. No, I ain't going to tell you. And I know who the Nightriders were in Princeton, and I ain't going to tell you that either. Out there, if you ever want them, they're available in federal court cases out there. And so what we end up with is a situation where these folks decided not to go after just tobacco, go after wheat. And if you want to go after wheat, blow up a thresher. And they blew up a thresher about 2 miles from right downtown Adams, blew up a thresher called the Denise thresher, and a whole lot of people were not able to make any money off of wheat that year. So it's not just over tobacco, they did other things. By the way, the Denise family is still a big family in Kentucky right across the border. You know where Guthrie is? Right across the border in Guthrie, still a big family today out there. And about 15 years ago, I was asked by Ruby Patch. Ruby Patch is the Linda Higgins of Clarksville, and so she did not call me and say, Rick, could you be available to come speak? She said, Rick, you're going to be there. You're going to be there. My niece family reunion is going to be in Adams at the pavilion where we do plays, and I'll talk to you about plays later. But she said, be there. And I said, yes, ma'am. And so she said, I said, but now, Miss Ruby, this is not a really good story. Some of your people might not be happy. She said, tell the truth. Don't ever tell a story to tell the truth. They will. And so I did, and I had a 90-some-year-old woman stand up, smack the table, and say, I cannot believe that you're here at our Manish reunion and you're bad-mouthing Manishes. Well, I'm just telling the story that asked me to tell out there. But that is a good 100 years after the Black Patch War, and that's how strong those feelings still were, and in some areas still are, about what happened in the first decade of the 1900s out there. So, one other story about the raid on Hopkinsville. A fellow named Meacham was mayor of Hopkinsville at the time. And so he badmouthed the Nightriders and the Kentuckian, the New Era, articles about the Nightriders and badmouthing them. And he made a mistake one time. He said, you know, if they wanted to really fight, tell them to come to Hopkinsville. Guess what the Nightriders did? They came to Hopkinsville. And guess who they wanted to find and whip? Number one on the list, Meacham. He heard them coming. He heard, well, first of all the telephones were cut off, and that's a sign the Nightriders are there. And so he snuck out of his house because he knew they were going to come find him. He snuck out of his house, went through an alley, and the closest thing to him was the Baptist church. He went down the coal chute in the Baptist church, and they couldn't find him. He's a Methodist. He's a Methodist. And that story is true that at the Baptist church at least saved one person. All right, Baptist. I'm a Methodist, by the way. You're Baptist over there, aren't you? I'm a Methodist. That was just a joke. All right. But it's hot in here. When it's hot, every now and then you better make folks laugh. But you do know that was a joke. All right. So you're not going to whip me outside. All right.
We'll just call them.
You what?
We'll just call them
Yes, ma'am. I don't argue with a woman. Nope. So what ended up happening? And it worked. I'd like to stand in front of you and say violence does not work, but it did. That massive violence in the Black Patch forced a lot of people to join the association, and then forced people, the tobacco company, to start paying higher wages, and people could feed their families again. And it came out of the fact that massive violence would happen. Let me ask you one other question here. Clarksville was the home of the American Tobacco Company in the Black Patch. Hopkinsville was the second of importance, and Princeton was third of importance to the American Tobacco Company. Why was Hopkinsville never raided? Why was they never raided? I mean, not Hopkinsville, I'm sorry, Clarksville. It was number one. Why wasn't it raided? I'll give you a hint. Think geography. Why wasn't it raided? Pardon? Say that again. The river. You got the Cumberland River there, and you got Red River running into the Cumberland, and that's what Clarksville's where it is, the junction of the rivers. And so the fellow who I mentioned earlier, who was Ben Sorey from Robertson County, and later Montgomery County, when he got burned out in Robertson County, he'd send letters to the Nightriders going, come on to Clarksville, we will show you a good time. They never could figure out a way. They could figure out a way to get in. They couldn't figure out a way to get out. That's why Clarksville was never raided. So what happened to the Tobacco Association What happened in 1914? What in 1914? Not in the Black Patch War, but in 1914 in world history. World War I started. The vast majority of dark fire then and now is sent outside the United States. Dark fire tobacco is too strong for most Americans to like and to smoke. Now, with a lot of things to chew that we use dark fire for, but most dark fire tobacco then and now is sent outside the United States, much of it to Europe, and then Europe to other places. So, the Germans used submarines to block British ports and French ports. The British and the French blockade German ports, and there's no place to send our tobacco. And so in 1915, the association decided to disband and tried to get back together after World War I, but it didn't work. And one last idea about the Black Patch War and the influence. When in the 1930s, the federal government gets around to doing something about putting a price base under tobacco, they also limited the amount of tobacco that could be raised. They used a pattern set by the association in the early 1900s to be the federal pattern about tobacco. So that's what happened in the Black Patch War. One other thing I've been asked to talk with you about, please. And one other thing is Bell Witch, which comes from Adams, 2 miles from my house. My name, David Redburn, and I'm dead. I've been dead since 1840. Don't y'all worry. The dead are allowed to come back to earth, not to do harm, but if they can do some good. And I've been allowed to come back to do some good. But I have got this doofus. I don't know what a doofus is. If somebody thinks they're real smart and they ain't, I got this doofus that's a great-grandson of mine who's from Adams, where the Bell Witch story is, and he goes all over the country talking about how that story ain't true. Well, you know, if you say the story ain't true, she's going to get you. So I get to come back and try to find that doofus so I can say, quit saying it ain't true, because it is. Because if you keep saying that, she's going to get you. And I tracked him all over the place. Like October, he was the guest speaker in rugby, and for a couple of weeks, and I got there and he was already gone. I heard he was in Princeton, and he gone. I'm here, he ain't here, and I'm still trying to find him. All I want to do is say, quit saying that story ain't true. And you wonder, by the way, why I'm wearing this? I had my throat cut when I was 19 years old. That sound familiar? I had my throat cut when I was 19 years old, drunk, playing poker with some of my kinfolk. They didn't like the fact that I won. One of them cut my throat. But I got my hand up like this. And so I was cut over here, but it didn't get me here. That's why I lived to 1840 out there. That's why I have to wear this. I don't want people saying, what's wrong with your neck? So, I've got to try to find him and say, quit saying you don't believe in the Bell Witch. This story is true. And I don't want bad things to happen to him. He is a doofus. He just won't shut up. So I'm going to give you a sense. I guess since I'm talking about the Bell Witch story, I probably need to tell you briefly what the story was. The story started about 1817. A fellow named John Bell came to Robertson County in the early part of 1800, same time that my people, the Redburns, came to Robertson County. And I was part of that. I was there during the Bell Witch story. So we all came about the same time that the Bells came, and he brought his family with him, and everything worked out good. lived in Adams, and we were close to where I lived. And so, about 1817, bad things started happening. Sounds would be in the house. People would have the covers pulled off of them in the middle of the night. People would start getting their ears. I'm not going to pinch your ear. Pinch your ear, smack people. All kind of things started happening, but it was small. And we would hear sounds. We'd hear sounds, like something rough, not words, sounds. Then over time, it becomes words. Just words, not sentences. And then it becomes sentences. And whatever she was, started actually talking with people. And started talking with people. People started, in the beginning, the Bell family wouldn't let anybody come. They didn't want anybody to know about this. There must be something wrong with us if a Hank is out there doing bad things to us. So they wouldn't, we didn't tell anybody. John Bell said, don't tell anybody out there. And so finally John Bell talked to one of his neighbors who was also a preacher, and he said, let me come over. Because you cannot just keep getting this kind of harassment, and it's getting worse and worse and getting more physical and more physical. We've got to try to figure out what this is. So the preacher came over, and the Hank, what became known later as the Bell Witch, said, I don't like preachers. You don't need to be here. I'm just hurting them a little. I've hurt you a lot. I don't like preachers. And so finally he told John Bell, he said, you've got to let people in the community know this. You can't just keep this hidden. You need help. And so people started coming, see chairs all around. There'd be time that the Bell family, big room in the house would be full of chairs, and people just sitting around. And slowly, after a while, this Hank, whatever it was called then, Bell Witch later, it eventually started talking with people. And when we started talking with people, that didn't mean he didn't do some bad things, so he might well be talking to you, and over here, smack you. People, you didn't see it, but something smacked you. Not women usually, by the way, in the beginning. Men. Over there. Especially if he spoke out. Started with slaps, and then women started with slaps, but particularly bad on Betsy. Betsy was John Bell's daughter, and she started doing really, really bad things to Betsy. Pinch her, slapping her, pulling the covers off of her, pulling her hair, and just torturing her every day. And other people would be on occasion, but Betsy every day. And Betsy was in love with a young man, and the witch said, you cannot marry Joshua Gardner. You think I'm being rough on you now. You cannot marry Joshua Gardner. And eventually she does not. But the trouble between the witch and Betsy gets worse and worse. And then so did the trouble with John Bell. For some reason, she hated John Bell above everybody else out there. And she loved his wife, Lucy. She didn't do bad things to Lucy. In fact, Lucy got sick and was in bed, and Lucy had food dropped from the rafters of the house down on that the witch knew that she liked. And she never did anything to Lucy, but she hated John Bell. And when asked, why? Why do you hate John Bell? I don't know. He just deserves killing. And after I get through for a while, I'm going to kill him. So John Bell is getting sicker and sicker. He can't sleep at night. Like he had something in his mouth where he couldn't talk. Like he said it like he had a big stick stuck in his mouth like this, and he couldn't speak. And this is going on for weeks, months, then eventually years. And when preachers got involved, one of the things that there was, any preachers in the room, by the way? Is there a preacher in the room? People go to church in the room? There you go. What the Bell Witch would do to the preachers in the room and people who claim to know the Bible well, say, come on, give me a verse out of the Bible. Just give me a verse. Somebody would say, Genesis chapter 7, verse 10. She'd quote the verse. Just like that. John, chapter 4, verse 1. She'd give them the verse. They couldn't give her a verse that she didn't know. And so she did that just to humiliate people who were Christians out there. So all of this keeps going on from 1817, 1818, 1890. And one of the things that she would say is, don't ever deny that I'm real. You know I'm real. And if you want me to show you, I can prove to you that I'm real out there. And that's why, by the way, I'm going looking for, what did I call him earlier?
Doofus.
I'm looking for Doofus, because he keeps saying that he doesn't believe in the Bell, and he tells people all over that he doesn't believe that the Bell Witch story is true. He said, oh, that's a good story, it's a good piece of folklore, but it's not true out there. And so this is a true story. I'm getting ready to tell you, this happened to Doofus. This shows you that he just ain't right. He is on the stage in Adams, Tennessee, within 3 miles of where the Bell Witch story happened, talking to the Robeson County Historical Society, and John Bell's great-great-great-great-great-grandson, Bob Bell, is on the stage talking before Doofus is going to talk. And by the way, I love this. He makes his living as an undertaker. That kind of is. And so he's talking about the Bell Witch story, and it's true. And I'm going to talk about the Nightriders. And when he gets done, I go on stage, but I cannot help it. Excuse me. Not I. He. Dave Redfern. And so he gets on stage, and he says how wonderful a story this is in the sense of folklore and passing on folklore from Robertson County to but it's not a true story. As soon as he said those words, this is exactly what happened. There's rafters. Remember I said that the rafters in the Bell house had dropped food down on Betsy? A squirrel starts running across the rafters. And his wife sitting in the audience, and she said, if that squirrel starts throwing things down, we're leaving. And so it runs across here, and nothing happens. And I continue to say that this story is a wonderful story, but it's not true. Now, in the next, not me, he. So, true. In the next week, his wife gets 100 tick bites working in her garden. Guess whose fault that was? Doofus. The refrigerator stopped, and she was kind of happy about that. $1,000 later, she had a new refrigerator. His daughter and her daughter, who's a nurse at the hospital in Clarksville, got a case of MRSA, and him and her had tickets to see Old Crow Medicine Show at the greatest place in the world to listen to music, the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville, and they can't go because they got to take care of the grandkids, so they have to give away almost $200 worth of tickets to other people. They loved it, by the way. And on top of that, Doofus lives on a river, and he goes kayaking all the time. So he goes down and put his kayak in the river, and a big tree, no rain, no storm like we had last night here in at home. None of that. There's a big tree laying over. So Doofus goes back, and he gets his chainsaw, and he comes out. He's a doofus because he has some steel-toed boots, and he ain't wearing them. And he starts cutting the tree up to get it out of the way so he can go kayaking. And one big piece of that tree fell on his right foot. It broke his big toe and the toe next to it out there. All those things within a week after he denied on the stage in Adams, he did not believe in the Bell Witch out there. And you know what that doofus still does? He still goes and tells people that he don't believe the Bell Witch story is true. Matter of fact, he has right now got a book at UT Press where he pretty well proves the fact that this story is not true. So y'all probably will never get to meet Doofus. Because he probably ain't going to make it through that book being published out there. So all of those things are going on And we get to 1820. We get to 1820. John Bell has gotten sicker and sicker and sicker. And the witch says, it's close. I'm coming after you soon. And so the Bell Witch kills John Bell last day of December, next to last day of December, 1820. And that story, which started in a little place, by the way, it wasn't Adams back then. It doesn't become Adams in the 1850s and railroads come through. And railroads greatly affected this whole area as well. But then it was called Red River. But that's the story that started in Red River with probably no more than a few hundred people living within several miles. That story becomes worldwide, becomes the best known story of this type, not just in the United States, but in the world out there. That might be a story down the road to talk to you about sometime in the future, because it is hot in here. It might be the witch doing that. If so, none of you deny the Bell Witch. Don't deny the Bell Witch is true. So don't do that. So all of that to say three things. We've got a tale here about what people did to help people who needed great help. We've got a tale here about people who needed great help and turned to violence sometimes, and that's probably not what they should have done, but that it worked. And we've got a story that becomes one of the best known stories in American folklore. And all coming out of a black patch that where I'm from is part of, where you are is part of. And so I'm going to shut my mouth and say, anybody got a question? Anything you'd like to say? Any questions anybody would like to put in front of? Sir.
My daughter was about 4 or 5 years old. She had never seen that happen. One had, heard about her. Got her up on, was that? You're not coming to, there's a daughter. She was like this. What? She's like this. She said, hey, what's it going to do to me? What's it going to do? I said, I'm going to sit up. I'm going to get rid of you. I'm going to sit you right now. But she said, Daddy? I can still remember that. The looks on her face. From that day to the Bible when we were down. But then me and the 7 I got to do like this. She said, all right. And the little girl came home and she still died.
She still died. Sir.
I enjoy watching the History Channel, and they have a program called Researcher. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. But one of the stories they had was in search of the velvet, and that they were telling the folklore, but then also approached it from the angle that it was actually a murder. Somebody tried to cover up.
Yes. Yeah. That's one of the storylines.
Yeah.
There was a murder of John Bell.
Yeah. Yes, and that, and the entire family was suspected. In fact, one of them, they said, was suspected all the way was the daughter.
Yes, that's a storyline. Another storyline was that Betsy and one of the sons learned what's the word method we can say on words and not move them out.
Ventriloquism.
Ventriloquism. That they learned ventriloquism, and it was them doing those things, I think. Yep. There's all kind of storylines about the Bell Witch. And by the way, in Adams, we have people come all the time that are spirit hunters, and they use other words as well. So we have people come all the time to Adams to try to figure out. One of them even he had people buried in a coffin. So that's too far from me. Sir.
In the book here,
Witch. Story of the encounter that I and some of my friends at Murray State in 1969 had with the Bell Witch. So,
You believe. Smart man. And that's the book that you gave me a copy of, I believe. Yes. Thank you. I shall read that tonight. Anybody want to, well, I've done this before, and most of you probably don't want to do it, just in case. Anybody in this room besides me going to say, I don't believe that story? So we got three dumb people in the room, besides me. And by the way, I have asked the Roberts County Historical Society, I've asked when I'm speaking with school teachers, and in Roberts County, almost nobody will admit that they don't believe this story is true. So in here, I got three.
Open it up. Now, he's Dukes.
Now, the doofus that he's looking for, and by the way, wearing this, saying my throat was cut and I died in 1840, my granddaddy, his great-granddaddy, at 19 years old, had his throat cut, and he always wore that out there. That's the people we come from. We called him the chief. Yep. Anybody else? Oh, behind me.
Read something once. Did Andrew Jackson come to that area to check out to see if it was somewhere?
That's a whole nother.
Is that a real plane? That's all I was
That is absolutely one of the best stories ever to get people to believe in the Bell Witch.
Tell us the story, please.
Pardon?
Tell us the story.
The story. Old Hickory, who wasn't afraid of nothing, was afraid of nothing. Two of the Bell boys fought with Old Hickory in New Orleans, and so they knew each other. And so he heard about what was going on, and so him and some of his friends leave the Hermitage, which is a wonderful place to visit if you never have been to the Hermitage. They come up and they get right outside the Bell property. The horses can't move. They're whipping them. Horses can't move. The carriage won't move. And they hear the witch's voice say, "Hey, Andy, you ain't coming in here." And after a while, he said, "Let me stay for a little while." And so he went in, talked with the Bells. Next morning, he left, and he never came back. And by the way, think about folklore, that story. If you think about a story that you want people to be interested in, if you can put the name of somebody famous in the story, that's exactly, and by the way, that story came from M.B. Ingram, who wrote the book in 1894 on the Bell Witch, and I see several heads shaking. Ingram wrote it in 1894. That book is still in publication today. That's the story. That's where the Andy Jackson story came from. But if you want to sell a book, put stuff in it that people want to know. Another one is a physical structure. Well, the Bell House wasn't there in 1894, but the Bell Witch Cave was. And thousands of people have come to Adams to go through the Bell Witch Cave. Anybody here? Back here? Sure. And by the way, me and his daddy spent the night in the Bell Witch Cave. And here I am. You what? And by the way, he's mentioning Ben's made a living. Anybody here raised dark fire tobacco? Did anybody ever raise it? Did you ever raise dark fire tobacco? That is one of the hardest jobs in the world to do. And by the way, I have as well. I put myself through Vanderbilt in a great part. raising dark fire tobacco. And when I started running my mouth for a living, my tobacco tools were on the wall. But dark fire tobacco is incredibly physical, and it'll make an old man out of you if you keep doing it at the time you're in your 50s out there. So, we can't understand what the Nightriders did without understanding that dark fire tobacco will kill you younger. It'll wear you out younger. So I kept understanding. What was the other point that you were asked about? About dark fire tobacco. Oh, Bim Eden. Bim Eden raised dark fire tobacco. He owned part of the Bell property where the cave was, and people wanted to come in the cave. And here we see, I'm going to work myself to death raising dark fire tobacco, or I'm going to charge people to come to the cave.
He couldn't write his name.
He what?
was smart. He couldn't write his name, he was smart.
Yeah, he wasn't educated, but he made a whole lot of money charging people to come to the cave, and a whole lot of stories that people believe today, Bim's thought up, so when they were in the cave, he could tell them. And there's people in the cave making sounds, so people go, that is the Bell Witch. I heard it myself. Anyway, we're probably kin to some of those people that got paid to do that. Anybody else?
Is there a cemetery near the Bell Witch Cave? Isn't there a cemetery there?
Bellwood.
Bellwood, that's there.
Which one?
Was there Monday, wasn't it?
Yeah.
There's several Covingtons and Sheltons buried there.
Yeah. And Covington is an old Robertson County name. That's where my wife and I are going to be buried. Well, I take that back. That's where the stones are going to be. I'm a fisherman. I'm a kayaker. I have been in Red Fern side of me. We never would have got grown without eating fish. And I've eaten all this fish out of the Red River and off the Suffolk Fork. And so I figure it's just fair. I told my wife, honey, don't waste the money for a big old fancy funeral. Burn me and put me in certain places in Red River. I ate all them fish. Their descendants get to eat me. That is a true story. But Patty said, well, we got to have stones, and the stones are bedwood. It's going to be a long time from now. Mr. Weeks gets me. It's going to be a long time. You're not going to let me go back in your car. This back here, by the way, is Brendan Barker. He's a professor of folklore at Indiana University. And I didn't see you raise your hand saying you didn't think it was true. Come on, dude. Oh, that's good. That is really good. I'm going to tell my wife on you. You don't want me to on the bad side. Tracy, help me out here. But there's three others besides me. Hey, young man, you didn't raise your hand.
No, he did.
All right. Anybody else? Anything? Questions? Anybody?
Just a comment thing with the black patch stuff and the Nightriders. On my grandmother's property, they had come up through the old road, and then there's an old bridge that they went over, and they went and hung a man in just the next county over and stuff. But she said they talked about hearing the hoofs on the old bridge for miles, and there were so many of them that went. And part of that bridge is still on my brother's property.
Yes. And I'll just one brief story in our family. My great-grandfather, Red Fern, in 1907, height of the Black Patch War, packed up my grandmother, your great-grandmother, in a wagon and took them to, anybody in here know where Monkey's Eyebrow is? There we go. We took them to Monkey's Eyebrow as far as they could get away from Robertson County, but still be in where you raise dark fire tobacco. And as things settled down, he brought the family back to Robertson County out there. I ain't going to tell you which side he was on, but I will tell you this: he killed a man in Monkey's Eyebrow, and that's why he had to pack back up and come back to Robertson County.
Most notable thing I remember about that 1880 is that the witch would love to go to where somebody, she called a little sugar back, He says, "Oh, sugar enough." I said, "Lord Jesus, I sure love to hear him pray."
So the preacher, Old Sugar Man, and made that preacher mad. Of course, that's why she kept calling himself Old Sugar Man. Yep, Old Sugar Man. Oh, thank you for reminding me of that. Please, ma'am.
My great, I guess it was great, but to Uncle Hezekiah Milton Oliver testified in that trial you're talking about.
You're not over. Or, yes, testified in, so I have read.
And I've got pictures of him in the tobacco patch, surrounded by the Kentucky State Guard, and on his front porch.
One of these days, I'd like to see that picture.
Okay?
I would love to see that.
I probably can show you that. I sent it to a lady because she wanted to see it.
Oliver was one of the bravest people to come out and
Or
openly.
Douglas.
Or doofus. So you descended from doofus.
Yes.
But yes, yeah, he was known as being incredibly brave because he was doing what almost nobody else would do. If I had read his testimony. Yes. Thank you for having the courage to say that.
Well, my husband's dad, they'd say, "Come on, Jim, it's time to settle up." So I got it on both sides.
We got it on both.
Either one.
So does he. And so do I. I think both sides. I think. Anybody else? Questions, comments?
Ricky was talking about the wheat thrashing a while ago. Mary Lee, do you know where the wheat thrasher is at? Is it still on your property? No. Okay. There was a wheat thrasher that my family barracks off, and they were the only ones in Western Kentucky that had the wheat thrasher. I have pictures of it. They used it at Dawson. They used it with the library. And I have a picture of my grandfather and my great-grandfather sitting on the wheat thrasher at Dawson Springs in front of Henry's Well. That's how they paid for it, was going to the community. Now, I don't know which side it was on. I don't think he designated who was going to thrash wheat for. I think it was $100 bill. But I have a picture of that wheat thrashing. And it wasn't Mary, it's not Robertson, but I don't know what's that name.
I don't know of one in Robertson County. If you ever find one up here, let me know. I would like to see a wheat thresher at the time of the fire.
I don't know where it went to. The University of Kentucky was going to get it, but I don't know.
One of these days, I'll be in Lexington. Okay. Anybody anything? Anybody anything? Going once, going twice? Thanks for having me, folks.
I had three words to say to this group and to Rick. To be continued.
I've only got like 1,000 stories.
I know. To be continued.